You woke up this morning and you remembered yesterday. You remembered last week. You can probably trace your memory back through months, years, maybe a decade or more without much effort. But there is a wall. A hard, invisible wall somewhere around age 3 or 4. And behind it, nothing. Silence. An entire life lived that you cannot access. Why? You were not unconscious. You were not asleep. You were experiencing the world with enormous intensity, learning language, forming attachments, feeling fear and joy and hunger. You were alive, but your brain decided none of it was worth keeping, at least not in a way you can reach. That is not a glitch. That is by design, and the reason goes much deeper than you think. This phenomenon has a name. Researchers call it infantile amnesia. The term was first popularized by Sigmund Freud in the early 1900s, though his explanation, that children suppress early memories because of unconscious emotional conflict, turned out to be mostly wrong. The real answer came later. Much later. And it is stranger than anything Freud imagined. Your brain is not a camera. It does not record experiences and store them in neat folders. Memory is a construction process. Every time you remember something, your brain is rebuilding that event from scattered fragments. Emotion, sensation, context, language. It is less like playing back a video and more like reassembling a broken vase using a rough sketch as your only guide. And here is the key. Language is the scaffolding that holds that vase together. When you were an infant, you had no language. You had sensation. You had emotion. You had experience so raw and immediate, it would overwhelm most adults. But you had no words for any of it. No labels, no narrative, no internal monologue saying this is what is happening to me right now. And without that narrative structure, your brain could not encode memories in the format that your adult mind later learned to retrieve. Psychologist Catherine Nelson spent decades studying how children develop autobiographical memory, the kind of memory that tells the story of your life. Her research showed that children begin forming retrievable long-term memories around the same time they begin using language to narrate events to other people. When a parent asks a child, "What did you do today?" and the child begins to answer, something changes in how that child encodes experience. The act of telling becomes the act of remembering. But before that stage, before you had words, your experiences were stored in a completely different system. A sensory system. A body-based system. Your nervous system encoded the warmth of being held, the shock of cold air, the pattern of a face that felt safe versus a face that felt threatening. That information is still inside you. It lives in your reactions, your comfort zones, your irrational fears, your immediate attraction to certain smells or sounds. Your body remembers what your mind cannot name. So where do those early memories actually go? The truth is, they do not go anywhere. They just become inaccessible to conscious recall. The memory system available to infants, called implicit memory, is not the same system you use to remember your first day of school. Implicit memory stores skills, habits, and emotional reactions. It is what allows you to ride a bike without thinking. It is what makes you flinch before you know why. Your infant experiences are buried deep in that system. They shaped the person you became without ever surfacing as a story you can tell. But there is a second layer to this mystery. And it is even more surprising. Even if you did manage to encode a memory in early childhood, your brain would have erased it anyway. Not all at once. Gradually. Through a process called neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons. For a long time, scientists believed that human adults stopped producing new brain cells after a certain age. That turned out to be wrong. Your hippocampus, the brain region most critical for forming new memories, continues generating new neurons throughout your life. In 2014, researchers Jonas Friesen and his team at the Karolinska Institute confirmed that adult human hippocampal neurogenesis is real and ongoing. And in infants and young children, This process runs at a dramatically higher rate. Here is the problem. When new neurons flood into the hippocampus, they do not just add storage space. They also disrupt existing connections. They overwrite old circuitry. Paul Franklin at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto published research in 2014 showing that the very same neurogenesis responsible for early brain development actively degrades memories that were previously encoded. Your brain was growing so fast in those first years that it was constantly wiping its own hard drive to make room for new connections. You were not forgetting because nothing mattered. You were forgetting because your brain was building itself at a speed it would never reach again. Think about what that means. The period of your life when you were learning the most, when every moment was a first, when your brain was forming at its peak rate, when the world was entirely new, is the same period your brain was least equipped to preserve. There is a deep irony in that. The most formative years are also the most forgotten. And yet, not everything disappears. Researchers have found that infants as young as 6 months can retain certain types of procedural memory for months at a time. A study by psychologist Carolyn Rowe Collier showed that infants who learned to kick their legs to move a mobile above their crib remembered the association weeks later when shown the same mobile. But ask those same children about it 10 years later, and they will have no idea what you are talking about. The memory existed. It simply became inaccessible in the form of conscious recall. What you do carry forward from those years is something more fundamental than memory. It is character. It is nervous system calibration. It is attachment style. The emotional blueprint that tells you how safe the world is and how trustworthy other people are. John Bowlby's attachment theory, developed through the 1950s and 60s, argues that the quality of your relationship with your primary caregiver in the first years of life creates an internal working model of relationships that persists across your entire lifetime. You cannot remember those years, but you are still running on the code they wrote. Your fear of abandonment, your capacity for intimacy, your default reaction when someone raises their voice, your ability to trust. These are not personality quirks that appeared from nowhere. They are outputs of a system programmed during years you cannot consciously access. That is the strange truth of infantile amnesia. It is not really about forgetting. It is about the gap between two completely different ways of knowing. Your infant self knew the world through sensation and emotion and physical experience. Your adult self knows it through language and narrative and self-reflection. And those two systems do not speak the same language. The translation was never made. The diary was written in a script that no longer exists. You will never remember your first word. You will never remember the moment you understood that the person holding you was your mother. You will never remember falling asleep to a voice that made the world feel safe. None of those moments will ever surface as a retrievable story. But here is what is remarkable. You woke up this morning shaped by every single one of them.